Spider-Man has had many adaptations. He's an iconic superhero with some equally recognizable supporting characters. And of course, villains. And he has some stories that end up being retold more than others. And it's not just the time that Uncle Ben died. One such is the tale of Venom and the alien or black costume. But did you know one adaptation altered a core detail in how this costume, this alien symbiote, affected Peter Parker? It did it in such a way that it affected bleed back and just altered how the story was adapted going forward. It would influence things and give us some classic memes. Which series was it? The 90s animated Spider-Man series. Now the 90s Spider-Man series, which originally aired from 1994 to 1998, is an important piece of Spider-Man media. It introduces many classic storylines, as well as characters to a mainstream audience. And in some cases, it adapts them quite well. Other times, not so much, or it's just interesting to see some of the hoops they had to jump through because of censorship or rights they didn't have. Now this series doesn't have quite the same lasting impact on the characters' depictions overall as say something like Batman TAS, which had begun a bit earlier in 1992, but regardless, this series is still worth a look. In all fairness, this cartoon does get discussed a little bit. When it does come up, it's often highlighted as underrated. It's just not as well known as some other influential superhero cartoons. It depends what era you're coming to Spider-Man in. And it's a very important moment and a first introduction for many who weren't reading comics to Venom. Because of timing, this is the first Venom adaptation. While the alien costume had debuted in Amazing Spider-Man 252 in 1984, Venom wouldn't debut until 1988, with a cameo in Amazing Spider-Man 299, and a full appearance in Spider-Man 300. The entire tale of the alien costume is a messy one. We've covered it a few times on this channel over the years, but it's been a few since the last time, so let's do a Cliff Notes. We need to, because it's relevant to how the series is going to adapt this. The idea for a black costume was initially pitched by a fan, Randy Schueller. This for a fan contest. Marvel editor Jim Shooter ended up purchasing the idea for $220. Initially, Schueller was involved in the drafts, but eventually the correspondence just fell off, and the story that was introduced ended up being different than the one they'd pitched, and some of the details were different. The costume wasn't black and red anymore, it was black and white. The original story would end up being created and released in 2019. We did a video on it, and if you're curious about that version, it is cool to check out and just see what could have been. How it ended up playing out was that the rumor leaked ahead of time that Marvel was going to change the costume, and the new costume appeared in Amazing Spider-Man 252, and even had a "It's true" on the cover. This was published in January. The cover date was May. I'll be referencing the publishing dates. But an explanation for how Peter got the costume didn't come till Secret Wars number 8, which was also in 1984, but in August, so a few months later. The explanation was that there was a machine in the hideout HQ on the planet that they were hanging out in, where they were holed up for that war of good and evil in space. Peter had seen that some other heroes had their costumes repaired, and so he went looking for where they did it. Peter found what he assumed was the machine, activated it because his costume was damaged as mentioned, and assumed they would get fixed, and instead got this intriguing black substance costume affixed to him. He was inspired in canon because he'd seen Spider-Woman's costume, that's Julia Carpenter version, and he thought she looked nice. It's a good look. Now at first there weren't really strong indications that the suit was sentient. It just seemed to be some kind of advanced alien tech. But that's not the messy part. The messy part is how the costume evolved because of fan response, and Marvel trying to accommodate it. Despite time of recording being hard pressed to find someone who doesn't think the black costume is at least cool, I know they're out there, but in general that's the consensus. At the time, some rather vocal fans did not like it. Boo! Bring back the original costume. People don't like change, and that still holds true. And at times I've been one of those people. It depends what the change is. We all have our hills, so plans were made to change it back, and a plot was quickly hatched around that. So it was then issue 258 in July of 1984, so yes, before the origins of how he got it were even published. At this point, Spider-Man would learn the truth about his alien costume, that it was alive, and he would freak out, and Reed Richards, aka Mr. Fantastic, would shoot the costume off him with a sonic gun, even though he wasn't sure that it would work. That's my read, never change. It did work, and the symbiote would find itself contained in the Baxter building. And then issue 259, Peter would be back in his original costume, huzzah! But no, boo! For in the interim, the fans who liked the costume had made their voices known, and some people really liked it. So that meant it was time to put it back on, or find a way to put it back on at least. So in Spectacular Spider-Man 99, published November 1984, in the issue with this great spot cover, Felicia Hardy, aka the Black Cat, made Peter a new costume that looked like the alien costume, because she said she felt he looked hot in it. He took it, but he wouldn't end up wearing it again for a little bit. This and Amazing Spider-Man 263, released January of 1985, and the reason why he put it back on was because he forgot to take his original costume out of the sink and he'd left it soaking, and now he had nothing to wear except this black costume in the closet. I love how flimsy these canonical reasons are. They're so good. They're so realistically mundane. I love it. Oh no, my costume's still wet. So Peter would pull out the one that Felicia gave him and he would wear it till Spider-Man 300. Why? Because Todd McFarlane finally won the editorial battle, which was him not wanting to draw that costume anymore. And so in canon, they came up with something very dramatic, which was that Eddie Brock as Venom showed up and terrorized Mary Jane, and she didn't want to see Peter in that costume anymore. It was a lot. Now, while the alien costume was officially revealed as Venom at that point in those 299 and 300 issues, it had escaped the Fantastic Four's containment a bit earlier, actually a lot earlier. It escaped in Amazing Spider-Man 261 and Fantastic Four 274. Both were published at the same time, October 1984. It would hide itself in Spider-Man's closet, seeking to bond with him again, which it would do in Web of Spider-Man #1 in January of 1985. But Peter quickly became aware that the costume was back on him and that he couldn't get it off. So he had to go on a quest for sonic sound, but he had to do this while he was fighting the Vulturions. He figured he couldn't make it back to the Baxter building in time, and he ended up in a church. And the church bells rang and they got the costume off him. But he was hurt in the process, and the symbiote saves him and dies. It looks like it dies, but then it's later retconned to him leaving. Like, look at this little spot. It looks like it could have dug a hole in the floor. It could be dust. It could go either way. It's what it needs to be. Because later they would bring it back and say that it just slunk away. It left. It was sad because Peter rejected it. Either way, the symbiote's back. In issue 300, it was revealed to have bonded with Eddie Brock, a disgraced journalist who blamed his failed career on Spider-Man. Even though he was the one who ran a story revealing the wrong person as the killer Sin Eater. That's Spider-Man's fault, catching real criminals. What a menace. So this storyline and the evolution of the costume took some time. Many issues across approximately 4 years. And the animated series had to do this in 3 episodes. 3 roughly 20-minute episodes. Now, at the time that this Spider-Man series came out, there was no question that the Venom storyline was going to be adapted. Venom had become quite the popular character since his introduction. In the early 90s, he was starting to get miniseries. In 1993, he had 4 miniseries. In 1994, 5. And that trend would continue for a bit from the early to mid-90s. So this was a character that was gonna show up, and he showed up in season 1 in episodes 8, 9, and 10, the alien costume, parts 1, 2, and 3. They are also the episodes where we get the wonderful chase you to the ends of the earth shocker line readings.
You can't escape me! I'll chase you to the ends of the earth!
So good. It's always good. There's so many edgy things about this series that I adore, like how the theme won't stop telling you that he has radioactive spider blood. I think it needs a bit more electric guitar. I love this theme. It's right up there with the American Digimon theme for me. Now, given the fact that this was an animated series, as well as the fact that there was lots of Spider-Man history, some things had to be changed. The costume couldn't be found in Secret Wars. At the time of the production, the company didn't have the rights to all those characters, and it also would be very complicated to introduce it in that way. It would be jarring. It would just stop the rest of the plot, and they were trying to have an interconnected plot that built upon itself, just like the Spider-Man comics, so that wouldn't have landed as well. So they had to find another way to introduce the symbiote. Now, instead of an intergalactic good versus evil space fight / toy tie-in, there was a modification of a plot from Amazing Spider-Man 41 and 42, 43 a little bit, but it also tied into Amazing Spider-Man #1. Let me explain. In the episode, J. Jonah Jameson's son, John Jameson, an astronaut, ends up bringing the alien symbiote back to Earth while they're attempting to bring back a mineral they found called Promethium X.
It's almost like the rock's bleeding.
The symbiote, of course, tries to take over them as they're landing, as is always what happens in this type of sci-fi scenario. Just don't try and bring things back to Earth. This, of course, means that they're coming in hot, Crash style. This plays upon how Spider-Man rescued John Jameson in Amazing Spider-Man #1, when his capsule was being launched into orbit and malfunctioned. Issue 41 elaborated on this event by having John show up and be talking with his father, telling him that he can now talk to him about some previously classified information, which was that he had come into contact with some space spores after his last spacewalk. So these two events are kind of combined and smushed together, and the space spores are replaced with Venom, or the alien symbiote. And then Spider-Man can come and save him at this point. So we're working together all these things. It's quite clever, actually. The Rhino debuted in Amazing Spider-Man 41 and is used in the Alien Costume Saga episodes. He's the villain who the Kingpin contacts to steal Promethium X, and this was also his first appearance in this series. So it was a nice way to have his first appearance line up in this way. This episode also follows up on the downward spiral of Eddie Brock, who in this series is directly directly competing with Peter and is looking to be rehired by Jameson, which he finds an opportunity to do when the shuttle crashes on the bridge, where he's stuck in traffic. Convenient. While he does take pictures of everything that happens, including the Rhino stealing Promethium X off of the ship, he doesn't tell Jameson that. He just tells him that he saw Spider-Man stealing something from the shuttle, knowing that Jameson's hatred of Spider-Man will lead to him believing him and that he can probably get his job back, and he does.
Just give me my old job back, JJ, and these pictures are yours.
This omission of having seen the Rhino at the scene leads to Jameson offering a $1 million reward. This for Spider-Man's capture, since he's already so biased against him. And his injured son did kind of mention him. Just the space things, Spider-Man, and that's good enough. This bit is kind of a reworking of Amazing Spider-Man 42, where it seemed in quotes, like Spider-Man had robbed a bank.
Now there's nowhere Spider-Man can run. At last he'll get what he deserves.
Spider-Man picks up the symbiote in the river and it clings to his costume, so he ends up accidentally taking it home with him. And in a sequence reminiscent of Amazing Spider-Man 255, it creeps off his original costume and onto him as he sleeps. In 255, it's just on a drying rack, but it's the same energy. All of this leads to a reworking of the nightmare sequence from Spider-Man 258, which is also referenced on the cover of that issue. In 258, we see Peter running through the streets, and he's drawn as the Steve Ditko Spider-Man from the early Amazing Spider-Man days, the original days. While he's running, the black costume looms over him, trying to get him, only for his original costume to enter the fray. The two costumes end up fighting over Peter as he screams that they're tearing him apart, and with that, he awakens. The alien costume part 1 takes this sequence and utilizes it for the alien costume taking over Peter's body as a host. The sequence is nightmarish, distorted, as it should be. The black costume in this case, however, is not fully formed and creates a disconcerting and ghoulish image. This choice makes sense because at this point he hasn't seen it on himself yet. There's also the nice detail of his costume being floppy, as there's no one in it. It's a very strong moment, and the nightmare's end of Peter being consumed would eventually find its way into the show's intro. Now from here, the plot starts to move at warp 8, and the next parts 2 and 3, warp 11. We're breaking the barriers. Still in part 1, Peter discovers that the costume augments his strength and speed, that it can also alter his appearance. I enjoy that he puts himself in this edgy rocker outfit for a second.
No, wait. How about that guy from Aerosmith?
But he also instantly finds himself feeling more confident, assertive, and that very, very quickly morphs into aggressive.
I've developed a lot more than a backbone.
Parker!
You know something, Peter? You are different, and you scare me.
Felicia is so odd in this scene. It's fine for Flash to bully him. It's not fine for him to stand up for himself. That's scary. Christopher Daniel Barnes, who plays Peter, does a good job of increasing the anger and antagonism into Peter's voice. And he's not afraid to eat the scenery as Peter loses it.
Shocker!
Very fun. You go, Prince Eric.
You don't know how different, but maybe you'd like to find out.
By the end of part 1, it's clear that something is wrong with this costume, and that it's altering Peter. He nearly kills the Rhino. He also sees something off in the reflection as he gazes into it. He sees a flash of what the symbiote will look like eventually when it bonds with Eddie. It's foreshadowing. And from here, we go on to part 2, and that part feels like we gotta hurry up. It even jumps into it feeling like we missed a chunk.
I have a spider sighting at 3 o'clock. Do you copy? Copy, Red Leader. Let's move in on our $1 million target.
Peter's on the run from police. He's even more aggressive. The costume's just pulling this way and that. Peter goes to Kurt Connors, the Lizard, to examine the costume, since the Fantastic Four weren't available at this point, so they had to find an equivalent scientist character who Peter trusted and could go to. And the Lizard fits that spot very nicely in this series. He also learns that sonic vibrations can hurt it. It's in this part where he loses it on the shocker, and the episode ends up recreating some scenes of Web of Spider-Man #1, specifically the end scene where he uses the bell to take the costume off. Only the episode cuts out the guesswork of what happened to the symbiote by having it drip instantly down onto Eddie Brock, who was webbed up before, rather than having the symbiote stumble upon him angrily praying in a church later. It all sounds incredibly straightforward. Or does it? Does it sound incredibly convoluted? I don't know anymore, I'm in too deep. But regardless, it's now time to talk about the change that altered things. What was it? Well, it's one so simple and intuitive that one may not assume it was a change at all. And it's an easy mistake to make. I know, I've made it. So with all that buildup, what is it? Drum roll? Well, it's the symbiote altering Peter's personality. Yes, all that ramp up of Peter losing it and his personality slowly shifting. That being what clues him into the fact that maybe keeping an alien costume of unknown origin isn't the best idea. That didn't happen in the comics. But it's really easy to assume it did. As someone who did just that, let me explain. One factor that can be at play, though it doesn't have to be, is the order that you come to this in. If you end up seeing the animated series first, which I did, it can lead one to read that into the original arc, which has a few key issues, but the suit is a B plot for a lot of it, and it's not even or really brought up. You get things like brief panel sequences in issues like 255. It's very blink and you'll miss it in some issues. That's part of what makes this so easy to superimpose onto the original text, but it's not the only thing. Part of it is because it's so intuitive. The idea that the symbiote amplified or bonded or influenced the host in some way would work its way into the comics. It was implied that the costume had been altered by bonding with Eddie, and it was shown that it had some lingering effects because it had been bonded to Peter, this on the symbiote. So it stood to reason, if one were to rationalize it out, that the opposite could be true. It's also just a really good reason for him to want it off. Something was wrong, it was changing him, it was making him someone he didn't want to be. It's more visceral and in line with the whole great power responsibility theme than what actually happened. What happened in the comics was that Peter was getting tired. Why was he so tired? Well, the costume was taking over his body at night while he was sleeping and taking it out for a joyride. Web swinging around the city with him. Looks so happy. Which is not great, and no, you would not want to keep a costume on that was doing that. But comparatively to it making him a worse superhero and a scarier, angrier person,
You scare me.
it doesn't have the same impact. And there are moments, if you're going back in the original story, that read like it could be altering him. Like in issue 252, where Peter flies into a fit of rage over not being able to sell any of the photos he took during Secret Wars. It feels a bit extreme and like it could have been influenced by this new costume. But in reality, that was just Peter at the time, prone to dramatic fits of melodrama and cursing his Parker luck and being Spider-Man. In all fairness, it is easier for the animated series to do this, to add this element and to condense all these story plot lines. The way it's able to work in an air of menace to the costume from the start is through the benefit of knowing entirely how the story would play out, and hence being able to take some of the stronger moments like the nightmare sequence and repurpose them. By placing the nightmare at the start of the costume takeover and not at the end, it foreshadows the costume trying to consume Peter, which is unique and something different than the usual Spider-Man is destroying Peter's life drama, which he was always having. And this 1994 animated series also managed to capture that anyway.
$1 million on my head. For once in my life, I'm worth something and I can't collect.
The way this nightmare was utilized also recontextualized the mental struggle as his dark side versus his heroic one. It makes the question of the costume a bit more interesting, and it allows you to present Peter as a person of strong moral character and conviction by rejecting the symbiote's amplification of his more negative traits. It also provides a stronger contrast between him and Brock when you see the severity to which Brock is twisted and embraces the symbiote versus Peter. Now, these episodes aren't perfect. Part 1 has the story plotted by Stan Lee and Avi Arad. The teleplay is written by Len Wein, Meg McLaughlin, Stan Berkowitz, and John Semper. This one is the strongest one and feels the least rushed, but you can feel a lot of hands on it and how it jumps, especially in between the Prometheum X plot and then the costume plot. Parts 2 and 3 have less writers but more to do, and consequently play out almost like cliff notes. But the ideas and the way they flow are solid, they just don't have a lot of time. Part 2 was a story by John Semper and by Bryn Stevens. The teleplay was by Stevens, while episode 3 was by John Semper and Mark Hoffmeyer, with a teleplay by Hoffmeyer. These episodes, despite their pacing issues, are a masterclass in how to take from multiple different comic sources and time periods, and create a fusion that maintains the core ideas and tone of the story, utilizing equivalent characters where necessary. This could have been 5 parts, but they worked with what they had. Spider-Man comics of old usually had multiple subplots that they were hopping between, oftentimes rapidly. When controlled, it was compelling and exciting. When not, it was much like the Alien Costumes Parts 2 and 3, but with less Windows Movie Maker's transitions. That's not a dig. I too used the Venetian blinds wipe back in the day. Now, this change of how the costume affected Peter would just become part of the Alien costume story going forward. It's one of those changes that just makes sense. Even though the personality alteration is a bit more basic, it works better with the themes of the story, and provides a bit more of a sense of urgency, a malevolence that makes one feel that the costume really needs off. Also, without this story, we wouldn't get the glory of Bully Maguire from Spider-Man 3. What a loss that would be. In later stories, it sometimes feels like this has been embraced by the comics as well, and again, at points it felt like it was happening in the past, like in issue 258, which had Peter webbing Black Cat to stop her from leaving without meaning to. It was meant to showcase that the costume was now doing things that he didn't know it could do, but it was a frightening moment and hinted at the suit having more control and responding to Peter's subconscious desires in ways that he didn't anticipate. But by the end of that issue, the costume was off and that was the end of it. This is a good change. The best bleed backs are ones that enrich the original story, or slot right in with no trouble. This does both. The fact that writers of Spider-Man comics had a hand in this change does help make it feel more authentic, like an evolution of the original concept now that there was a distance to examine the alien costume saga as a whole, rather than as it was unfolding. It's certainly far less convoluted than some of the retcons that would come later with the symbiotes, or specifically to Venom. Like, oh, the original Venom symbiote, it bonded with Deadpool. That's why it's already unstable when it bonds with Peter. I'm eating my hair. Stop, it's time to stop. No more null, no more. What did you think of the alien costume saga episodes? I know I left part 3 mostly alone. That was the Eddie/Venom tries to ruin Peter's life episode, so our bleed back came before. But that episode's good too. It's slightly less fast-paced than part 2, only slightly. Did you know this was a change from the comics? Do you agree that it makes it better? Do you agree that it makes sense? If not, why? Did you like the Spider-Man 1994 animated series? Okay, I'll stop. That's enough questions. Tell me things and leave the answers down below, and just whatever else you want to talk about. Thanks so much for taking some time to spend it discussing comics and comic adjacent things with me. I always appreciate it. There will be more videos. Like, share, comment, subscribe, and I will see you again soon. Bye-bye.